things. The reason why we are so interested in paid is often that then we can start talking about a real return of investment. And that's a lot of our customers are very interested in actually understanding that. Maybe you can imagine that as a B2B marketer, you're doing marketing, but often from you doing a campaign to you actually kind of close the deal, it can easily take 6-12 months. Additionally, there's many touch points. So not only from an individual, from that one individual, you're kind of maybe are kind of targeting on ads, but that individual also has colleagues, and that's also impacting the deal. So it's a complex kind of matter of understanding that. And so that's what we are helping with. We pull all that data in, we build a kind of a account-based data model where we have a view of all users and which company they belong to and how much revenue kind of that company you can account for. And then we describe it with visualizations. And the more the right side of things, we won't talk so much about today. So what we were doing is that we were asking our customers, so this is what you can see on the screen. We were asking our customers to go in and authenticate with all these kind of different tools. We would then pull down the data using Salesforce APIs and so on, and basically kind of get the data into BigQuery. And for those who's familiar with, I mean, I assume most people here are familiar with Redshift, the BigQuery, and Snowflake at some level. And here we kind of, one of the things we learn very quickly is that we can't just add indexes on a lot of fields. And that's potentially a problem. So when we were kind of putting in the data, we couldn't just put an index on, let's say, the account or the customer ID and the timestamp, so we could kind of query the data very efficient. Or if we did, which in BigQuery would be a partition key for the timestamp and a cluster key for the customer ID, then we would actually have to use both the timestamp and the customer ID to get an efficient performance out of that. Which there's a lot of cases for us that was not ideal. So we started kind of pulling all the data in, but we didn't know how we could kind of how could we actually take that data, model it, and then take it on into kind of a large stream of data modeling. And here you see maybe some of the problem. On the right side, you see a picture from a screenshot from the dependency graph inside Dataform. And we actually had, so now I took this earlier today. And so it was actually even more ugly when we started this project, because then all the different integrations, they would also be here. So we actually had to kind of combine all the data sources and all the data modeling in one big project. And actually even worse, we would even have to combine that for all customers. So actually for us to build the first version of this, we had to build, we had to run the data model for all customers in one big go. Luckily, BigQuery actually managed that, or the combination of Dataform and BigQuery actually worked pretty well there. So we could actually do that. But of course, we wanted to do more. So we were looking for a solution so we could kind of run the data model only for one individual customer. We also were concerned, so I think the first suggestions we were looking at with Dataform was actually to have maybe a Dataform project per customer, which we were also concerned about, because maintaining that and ensuring that all customers were running the same code, that was, worrying for us. And then last, we also needed to be able to automate this. clearly, so at this, like before we started this, actually every time we had a new customer, we had to go into a Dataform project or into Git and just add that customer with some configurations manually. And we couldn't see ourselves do that. So we wanted, when for example, here a customer would connect to Capterra, we just wanted that to be seamlessly and no human touch involved, right? And overall, the big challenge for us was then when we were running this, Dataform didn't support us passing in per run some dynamic parameters that would kind of help us figure out which customers to run the Dataform. But luckily, Dataform at least started solving some of the problems here. So we started using Dataform packages. I mean, now I'll just go out. I mean, anyone using Dataform packages? A few. Yeah, Dataform is great. Good start. But if you're not, I would definitely recommend to look into it. It's a really cool thing. And so, of course, our use cases may be different than a lot of Dataform customers, where I'm assuming a lot of the data stuff is like running internal data pipelines, where packages are maybe less needed to some extent, I guess. But for our use case, where we're actually building a product on top of Dataform, it turns out to be really useful. So we started taking each of these integrations, let's say Salesforce, and then we built a package for Salesforce that would give an input, and an input would be typically a customer and maybe some configurations. Then we could generate the SQL for each of those customers. Then additional for us to actually run this, Dataform needs to know a little bit more. So Dataform is static in the sense. So if the model, when it runs, doesn't know anything, it can't kind of generate the code. So the way Dataform works is that you're writing some SQL, and then Dataform kind of compiles that into basically you writing some SQL or maybe also some code, and the combination of that is compiled into like normal SQL. So you can't pass in, at least not yet. And I'll repeat that. I think that's a good feature request. But so we actually passing all these configurations and all the list of customers into each project. And you can kind of see it over here. We have a file called accounts, which actually contains a list of all the customers we have that is using HubSpot. Additionally, for us to trigger a data model to be built from outside of Dataform, we needed to build to add schedules inside the Dataform. So if we would actually, let's just do that. If we would go to the project, I think that was HubSpot we had there. Then we are actually adding, for each of the customers who's using HubSpot, we are adding a schedule, and which is what is very hard to see here, but these schedules are actually disabled. I think there. So they're disabled right now, those projects, and the reason why we're doing that is so that we can actually trigger a build or a data model build to run from the outside. And I'll show you in the next picture why that's important for us. I think it's a little bit, I think that is actually important for a lot of people, that you can trigger Dataform from the outside. So for those who's maybe using Airflow or other things to kind of run their schedules, then or downloading your data, then you can maybe imagine that, hey, you're running some job inside Airflow that is downloading the data from wherever and putting it inside your data store, and then you can trigger Dataform to run the data model exactly like from the moment when you have the data available. Yeah, so basically the input and the configuration enables us to kind of build the data model for that specific customer without having to run the rest of it. And then the rest is some infrastructure we had to build around to make this all work. And I'll kind of just show that. And this, I'll walk through it. So it starts over here. The user is authenticating. So that's what we saw on the first place here. So they would authenticate to some of these tools. When that happens, we would trigger probably, I'm pretty sure there's a queue in between here, but that doesn't really matter. We'll trigger that the data to be downloaded and extracted. So let's say this is Salesforce, then there would be a job pulling in data from Salesforce, and then in the first step, we will put it in Google Cloud Storage. When it's put there, we would have a cloud function triggering it. It would trigger kind of two things. First, it would trigger, hey, we would add the customer and the schedule to the Dataform project, to the Salesforce Dataform project. And second, it would also load the data into to BigQuery. Yeah, let's not go into why we are kind of doing this step in between. And then at the end, when that's kind of done, it would trigger Dataform to run. Now Dataform for that one customer. So it would then build the model and then kind of serve it back the normalized model. Then some of these kind of we're doing incremental updates on most of these tools at a nightly, at least nightly kind of schedule. So that's an example where we have a schedule running that triggers, hey, update the data. We don't use Airflow here, but I think a lot of people would be using Airflow for stuff like this. I'm not a big fan of Airflow, so if I'm talking a lot about it, I would not recommend using it. But if people are using it, then you could do this, right? So we extract the data, and as soon as the data is extracted, we would trigger Dataform to actually run the build so that we have the data as fresh as possible, as fast as possible, with kind of no delay. And because all of these services are actually serverless, then it would also scale really well for us, which is some of the things that is very important. But I think what people have to see is that it actually requires a little bit of infrastructure around, and I think one could argue this is really bad, but the way I'm arguing this is that it's actually a very good thing. I'm looking at this as a microservice, and the project, our Salesforce project inside Dataform, is just one microservices, which job is to take the raw data, process it, and normalize it so that another service can take that as input to building a larger data model. So when you see this picture, in essence, we have a lot of these pictures, and for us, that's just a service or one larger kind of context, and other services would depend on that. Yeah, and I guess also my time is up, and that's also the last slide I have. Thank you. Yeah, and questions are more than welcome.
Cool. Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to shout out or type them in the chat. Yeah, Dan, go for it.
So I imagine, especially as you described that as microservices towards the end, that like the nice thing about that is it means that as parts of this infrastructure stop working for you or maybe become too expensive, you can obviously kind of swap them out, and it's reasonably compartmentalized, and rather than having to rewrite your entire architecture, you've got these reasonably clear smaller pieces. To what extent is Dataform like potentially a long-term piece of the puzzle versus something that was really good to get you started, but it won't work in the long term? Like how to what extent do you think that will actually scale?
So I at least at the moment we're looking at it very much as a long-term thing. So I think when we really started building these data models, so the very first version we had was actually so if you're familiar with Google Apps scripts, you can actually run jobs from in there and schedule them. So that was actually our very first version of this. And then I kind of spotted you guys, and I wouldn't recommend that either. I mean, today we have Dataform, so that's much better. But so then we started using Dataform, and I think we had some troubles of because Dataform is thought a little bit as a service or tool to help the internal data team, and they can actually, like when you're an internal data team, you can actually hard code all the data stores inside Dataform. That's no issues at all. But we can't do that, because if we would have to do that, then we would actually kind of hard code for all our customers, and that's kind of not idle. Could we do something else? I guess so, but I think it's very convenient to kind of write this kind of code inside Dataform. I think more we would see ourselves maybe use the open source model if we can't like find it, but I would prefer not.
Cool, thanks.
Cool. Does anyone else have a question?
I guess just a real quick follow-up. I mean, as you pointed out, like it's a sort of a complicated system with a bunch of moving parts. How do you find managing that operationally? Like, do bits flake out often for you? Like, what's
I mean, the drawing is not precise in that sense. What we do have is a lot of monitoring and also Slack messages. So both Dataform, if kind of one of the data models fail, then we'll kind of put a Slack to the team. And similarly, we have other places where we'll do a similar process. I think now I manage at least relatively a lot of teams that all were running hundreds of microservices, and on paper it seems very complicated, and it can also be. But I would say that the advantages of running microservices versus doing a monolith is so much bigger that even though there is an additional complexity and dependency graph that is sometimes invisible for people, then it is preferred by far. The larger teams or the more teams you have, for sure.
Cool. Okay, unless anyone has anything else to add, I think we can say thanks to Ole, and I'll introduce the next speaker. So next up we have Mike Lee, who's head of data at Echo. So I'll hand over to Mike.
Thanks, Tracy. Hi, everyone. Give me 1 second to present. Cool. Hi. Yeah, like Joe said, I'm Mike, head of data at Echo. And I'm just going to very quickly put a warning in now. My dog is in here, and now is about the right time when he becomes like super attention seeking. So I apologize if you hear any growling or any running around or whatever. There's not very much I can do about it. So yeah, like Joe said, work at Echo, and the talk that I'm going to be doing today is a bit about my experience of reorganizing the data team at Echo. There's dog noise. And yeah, so basically, I joined Echo like about a year ago, and like 6 or 7 months ago, moved into the role that I'm in now. And in that time, we've done a little bit of a change, and so it's just talking about my experience and what we've done. Yeah, very quickly going to run through because I know we don't have loads of time. We'll start with a bit of an intro to Echo and who we are and what we do. Talk a little bit about how we're structured. Then the kind of before data team structure, which was a centralized data team, and the after, which is embedded in what we are now, and then some stuff that I learned along the way. So this slide here shows kind of what the being an NHS repeat prescription patient looks like for most people on the NHS. So the top line here is kind of what most people do. So visit GP, then go to a pharmacy. If they're lucky, it's in stock, but if they're unlucky, it's not. And they kind of go home, go back again, and then eventually get their prescription. Then have to remember which day to take what and at what time, and you know, after which meal and all that kind of good stuff. Another option is they just kind of forget. Or the third option, which is the good option, is use an online service such as Echo to help them with that. And so here's our kind of strap line, which is the simplifying pharmacy. And I think that's really cool here. They're like clarifying message below. We talk about creating a world where people, medicine, and data are connected. And like data is very central to what we do at Echo. In fact, so much so that my predecessor in this role is now actually the CEO at Echo. So we really believe in data, and I think that's central to our what we're trying to do. And so the kind of three like key offerings that Echo has is we have like a mobile app and a web app that patients can use to manage their medication, and then they use that to like give us indication of when they need new medication. Also, we do completely free delivery, so we don't charge anything for the delivery service. We make that back at scale, and then we also do reminders for telling people when to take their dosages, but also when they're going to need to order a repeat on the medication and when they're going to run out. This wouldn't be a data presentation without a chart. So here, this is just a bit of a chat about how fast we're growing. So this slide shows the PACS dispatch and active patients since January 2019. And as you can see, in the last year, we've grown about 11.5% in terms of dispatched PACS. And also a note to say that in like the COVID peak times, we also grew about 2.5% in about 3 months, which was pretty intense. And as I'm sure you can imagine, like, because we're offering like no, you don't have to no contact with pharmacists or anything. We became a pretty hot proposition overnight, so that was kind of stressful, but it was cool, and we learned a lot. And we have really aggressive growth targets. So yeah, the green is actuals, and the grey is like our targets, and we want to grow a lot more than we are now. We're not even yet at 1 million packs dispatched a month, and by January 2022, we want to get to 3 million. Our old CEO used to have a really cheesy line where he said we're just getting started, and I think that applies when you think about our growth targets. And so yeah, we're pretty aggressive in what we're trying to do. So this is just some notes of like how we structure ourselves at Echo. So yeah, our two main teams are tech and operations. So operations being the people that actually like run the pharmacy and pack the medication and kind of send that stuff out. And then tech, of which data is a part, being the people who make the app and the web app, but also all the internal tools we use to manage operations. And then there's some other stuff as well, but you know, like HR and finance and stuff. But for the purposes of this, perhaps not super important. And yeah, data is part of the tech organization, along with software engineering, product design, and also product management. I guess worth pointing out at this stage, the data team at Echo is, to give you a size of scale, is like 1 data lead and 3 data analysts who are all on this call. Very loyal, well done. Cool. So one of the first things we did when I kind of stepped into this role was to think a little bit about what our mission is. So we kind of did like a workshop, And there's a bit of contention in the wording that I've put here. In fact, I think this is my version of the wording, and we'll learn later what we actually like best. But roughly speaking, what our mission is to ensure that Echo makes great decisions by supporting the business with the data it needs. And this kind of mission statement here is drove the decision to like, okay, well, maybe the team structure that we had wasn't quite right for what we were trying to achieve. And so kind of carrying this forward in your head for the next few slides. So yeah, like I say, when I stepped into this role, we were in a centralized data team, which what that looked like at the time, a bit confusing because we just restructured some of our product teams, but you don't really need to know that. But a centralized data team where the data team was kind of a separate thing away from the product tracks that we organize ourselves into, which are the things on the left here, which consist of like product managers, engineers, product designers. And yeah, what we have here is like a complete separation. And so we're kind of a functional team. And what that means is we end up almost being like a support function for the product tracks, which if I talk about the kind of good and bad stuff. The good thing about this is it was really easy to have a really strong sense of team. You know, we literally have all of our like stand-ups, all of our planning sessions together. We're kind of together all the time. And it was very easy to like create and keep on top of any processes that we might want to use. So obviously we're Dataform customer. And if we want to change anything about like, the way we do PRs or we also use Looker about anything else, those kinds of things, it was really easy to keep on top of that. The bad thing, I think the biggest kind of bad point about a centralized data team was prioritization was really hard. So it became like quite apparent quite quickly that I was the only person that really seemed to have context on everything that was going on. And so I became the like central point of thinking about, well, should we do ticket A or ticket B? And that actually became like a very joyless task quite quickly. And I think frustrating for some of the analysts because it was like, they want to be able to decide what they're working on themselves and not really have to rely on me. I think that links into the not as much freedom that I think in a centralized team like this, where you're a kind of support function, analysts become like analysis machines. And so, you know, you plug in ticket and you get out analysis at the other end, and not given maybe as much freedom as I'd like to be able to give them to like explore and kind of look around and look for opportunities. And then the other one is we're relying on non-data people to identify data needs. So when we're not part of that kind of product track, I'm relying on, you know, probably a product manager to say, I think I need data for this, or I think I need data for that. And that's probably not the most reliable way to make sure that we're giving the data that we need to all of the problems that we need to give it to. So here's the after. Note the difference, the data analyst being part of the product tracks. Now, actually, this is a bit of a hybrid. So we kind of did for a while completely embedded, where the only kind of central away from the product tracks person was me. We've kind of landed on this model. I'll talk a little bit about why we've ended up with one analyst a little bit away from the tracks. But roughly speaking, what we've done here is, yeah, we've just put the data analyst in the team, which practically speaking means, you know, no, they don't come to the planning sessions run by me. They're not relying on me for prioritization of their work. They're not relying on me to tell them like, this is the thing that you should do next, or any of that kind of thing. Good thing about embedded data team, we're much closer to decision makers that we want to help. I mean, coming back to our mission, we are like front and center with the people that we're trying to help with the data that they need. It became a lot easier to spot opportunities. You know, we're literally, the analysts are literally part of those teams, so they can see like, oh, you've made an assumption here that I don't know if it's necessarily validated, and they can kind of go away and help and do that. Yeah, prioritization became pretty easy because I give an analyst a problem space, and I say, this is your problem space and your product space, and you have complete oversight, and you can work out what is priority in that space. And also a lot more freedom to kind of explore. You say, this is a space, go and explore it. Like, add as much value as you can to it. And I think that has allowed people to kind of work a bit more broadly than they used to. The bad thing here, it's a little bit harder to retain a sense of like a data team. I think also we changed this structure like right about the time that we went fully remote as well. So probably a little bit of extra stuff added in there. But yeah, practically speaking, there are things that we can do to do that. So we do still have retros together. We kind of have like knowledge sharing sessions. We actually have daily stand-ups at the moment, which is kind of check-ins. And then harder when requests come from outside of tech. So as I mentioned, it's not just tech, there are other parts of our org. And this is why we've ended up with a kind of person who's a little bit away from the product tracks, who can have the headspace to kind of step back and think, well, maybe there's a thing I can do over here that doesn't quite fit inside our product track spaces. Yeah. And so this is absolutely not an exhaustive list of the things that I learned in this process, but I think the three big ones are these ones. So first up, better suited to proactive analysts. So I think moving to a better model required analysts to dive into the product teams to understand where they could add the most value. This requires a level of proactivity that I don't think comes naturally to all data analysts. At Echo, that's actually the case. Like, everyone is super proactive. And I think that perhaps by design in our hiring process, we ended up there. But I've definitely worked in the past with analysts who that wouldn't be well suited for. So I think that's certainly a consideration. It's tempting to think and plan a lot when you're going to make changes like this, but I actually don't think my thinking or planning really added very much at all. I found it the trap of thinking I needed to think about all the answers to all the questions before we could like make a change like this. But in reality, all of the analysts are very smart people and can work out most of it on their own. And the tricky stuff we can discuss in our like one-to-ones and stuff. So that was really not a value add thing. And then this kind of sounds funny because obviously I am an analyst, but analysts are helpful in areas other than just analysis. Like, I think I probably knew that beforehand, but I've learned it in a quite practical way. So in the centralized model, as I said, with like analysts being kind of analysis machines, they kind of just do analysis. You know, give ticket and they can produce something. But in a product team where you kind of give an analyst a space to own, they can add value in very different ways. I think one of the good examples of this is, so we use like Segment to track events in our patient-facing apps, and previously, like before analysts being part of teams, the data team weren't really involved in like thinking about what we should track and what we shouldn't track, and so we ended up with just like tracks on everything, because you give it to a software engineer, they think very literally. So everything was tracked, every single thing that could happen, and that ended up being like a horrible thing, a horrible process to do. And obviously on the other side, it's an analyst that you're expecting to kind of look at these tracks and learn something from them. And so what we learned is that if you put an analyst in at the start there, they're not actually doing any analysis, but they're helping you talk about what you should track and actually kind of quite crucially what you shouldn't track, and being able to kind of offer the insight of like, well, this is how I'm going to analyze it, so this is what I need. And that has like developed into like a much nicer process, and meant that the tracks that we have now are in a much better shape than they were. Not the only example, but I think probably the easiest to explain example of things that we've kind of learned is this. Yeah, like I say, a bunch of other things I've learned, but these are probably my favorite three. Yeah, that is it. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Mike. I have a question.
Yes.
How was the before switching into embedded system? Like, did the number of analysts match with the number of product teams? Like, this is one problem we have right now. Like, we have around like 10 product teams, but around 5 analysts. And like, we want to try embedded model, but we can't really hire 5 more analysts just to try if it will work. So we are kind of struggling in that. How was the situation for you?
It's a good question. We didn't have, and then we hired. But I think probably you don't. For a while we had one team that didn't have an analyst in it because we were conceptually thinking that there wasn't like a big analysis need from that team. Yeah, appreciate like doubling your analysis team just to be able to change the structure probably isn't going to work. Yeah, to be honest, we found that the concept of like, oh, this team doesn't need an analyst was actually like quite poorly thought through, probably as much my fault as anyone else's. Like, there aren't data tickets unless you have a data person to identify the data needs, is like roughly speaking what I learned. So if you think that one team doesn't need a data analyst, like if you put an analyst with them for a few weeks, you'll realize that they kind of do. I think there's like a good ratio between like engineers and analysts. I think like 3-to-1 engineers, roughly speaking, 3 engineers will produce enough stuff so that there's an analyst that has like a full-time job with stuff to look at, is what we've kind of seen at Echo, which another reason why we have a central person is because our software teams have 4 engineers. And so there's probably just a little bit too much going on. And so the person that's not in one of the teams is able to kind of help out as and when. But yeah, I think I don't have a great answer to that question. Sorry about the squeaky toy. I'll take that one away next time. Yeah, I don't have a great answer, but I think you could try doing like, it depends what the output is of the teams, I guess, and like what the data needs are. I think you could easily try attaching analysis to 2 teams, but they'd have to be super close in what their product space, their like problem spaces were. Otherwise, you'd have problems with like context switching and stuff.
Thanks.
I have a question as well, if that's all right.
Sure.
Quite different, very, very like practical. So I'm assuming that because you're on the Dataform call that you use Dataform, and we have recently switched to a structure a bit like yours, so having analysts embedded in teams. And one of the, maybe not like hurdles, but one of the things we've encountered is that because you have analysts in different teams contributing to a single shared project in something like Dataform, that like ownership on who reviews and ensures that the code base doesn't just become this, like is contributed to by analysts in a cohesive way. So I was wondering if you have a process for ensuring all these analysts who work across all these different teams write code to the same standard and commit to like shared repository in the same way, etc., and how you manage it.
I can see Emily smiling, so I think she probably thinks this is a funny question. Yeah, I think that's kind of tricky. So the process that we have now is that we have a Slack channel with just the data stream in it that is just for PRs. And whenever we're making any kind of significant change, we put a PR in it, and we have to tag at least 2 people to say, please look at this PR and like check that you think it's okay. And then at least one of those people has to actually look at it. It's not perfect, but I think it pretty much does what we need it to do. Yeah, I mean, with like 4 people, it's always going to be hard to make sure that like what needs to be checked is checked, but also that things just don't explode out into like a crazy thing. I was very tempted to, after Ole showed his dependency tree, I was very tempted to put mine up because it is insane. I actually can't fit it on one screen on Dataform. Yeah, I think, yeah, that's the kind of best process that we've got to so far, is just like getting people to check stuff that we think is significant. But there's definitely I would say there's definitely more than 0% duplication in some of the stuff that we do. And yeah, when it's not the cleanest of Dataform projects.
So I can add to this that I had that problem as well, kind of while at Trustpilot, also on not data engineers or data analysts. What I experienced was kind of good was that if you, I mean, here, Mike, you are kind of the lead outside the teams, I assume. And so there's a little bit of other work going around, and then kind of setting up forums where the entire team can meet and spend some time together, and also discussing things that are maybe a little bit more long-term, and then also that the team has some type of freedom to fix some of those problems, like whether that is bad code or building something so that we can do something smarter or whatever. That there's a flexibility to some degree on that, right? So they don't only work on whatever is the priority of the team. And I think that worked out pretty well. So originally I was inspired by the Spotify model on that, but yeah.
One thing that I would add on our process, I work with Mike at Echo, is that the key that we've kind of found to it is working out what sort of needs to be reviewed, because obviously we want to be working fast and just getting analysis out and not having to wait on people to review our stuff. So we kind of isolated two rules for it. The first rule being, if you're just unsure on any logic, then you should just get reviewed. And the second being, is this work going to be useful for anyone else to know about in the team? Like you might be totally 100% sure on the logic, but it might be a kind of key table that can be used in a lot of different areas that you think other people should know about. So you just kind of put a note in the channel saying like, this doesn't need to be reviewed, like it's been pushed, but FYI, this is what it does. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for everyone's answers. That's really good, actually. Good food for thought.
Cool. Does anyone else have one last question for Mike? No? All right. Cool. Okay. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, if you want to share your slides in the chat the same way Ole did, then people can have a look at them if they're good to go. Okay, cool. Last up, we have Jim from Prolific. So I'll hand over to Jim.
Awesome. All right, I'll try and present now. So let me know if, can you see this?
Yeah.
Good. Awesome. Cool. I can't see you anymore, so I'm going to assume you're all smiling and interested. Great. So my name is Jim. I'm a data analyst at Prolific, and today I'm going to be talking about our data journey over the last year, really, and how we unified a ton of different data sources into a common format that we aimed to make useful to unlock analysis within the company. We really wanted to empower our whole team to get their hands dirty and dig around in business data and make decisions based on that data. I'm going to try and blast through these slides because I reckon I've made too many, but we'll see how we go. So a bit of context. What is Prolific? Prolific is a two-sided marketplace. We connect researchers from academia and industry, mostly in the fields of psychology, economists, behavioral scientists, user researchers in the industry, and we connect these researchers with people who want to take part in research online. And the role that we fulfill is managing the filtering, the finding of those participants, the posting of adverts. We facilitate payment, we facilitate great data quality. But actually, for the context of this talk, you probably don't need to know too much about us as a business. I joined about 2 years ago, which is when the company really started to kind of take off and grow fast. I was the 8th employee at that time, but there's now 31 of us. Even this photo is, well, back when you could still hang out in person. This photo is pretty old now, but as our team grew and as our our user base grew, so too did our data ambitions. So as you may have spotted on the last slide, our two founders have PhDs. There are many other people in the company who really live and breathe data. The team has a lot of kind of numerical competency, and so we wanted to make our business decisions on this basis. We wanted to leverage all the different data sources we had in the company. So this diagram here, can you see my laser pointer, virtual laser pointer?
Yeah.
Great. So this diagram shows what our data stack looked like about a year ago. There were only 2 data analysts in the team at this point. We had our production database, which was a MongoDB, and you could do some direct analysis off that database in Python, but our primary BI tool was Amplitude. This is, I think a lot of you are probably familiar with Amplitude. It's a kind of event-based BI tool that provides a UI. And so we were using Amplitude to compile a lot of the best data sources that we could together into Amplitude's database. But we also had data going into Google Analytics, so page view data. And we even had data sources that were critical to our business, like Zendesk data, that we couldn't analyze in any meaningful way. And so there were a load of problems with this setup. We had out-of-date, incorrect data from event failures that was being used for decision making because we didn't have any better way to get access to that data. There were questions we couldn't ask because some of the data which you needed was in Google Analytics, and some of it was in Amplitude, and some of it was in the production database, and you couldn't link these data sources up. We were running up against like plan limits and cost scaling issues with the third-party providers, and the main kind of blocker is that different people could go into the myriad different ways you could approach data analysis at Prolific, and because of the different routes, you could get different answers to the same question. So we knew something had to change. We set out to radically overhaul the way which we worked with data in our company. We did quite a bit of research. I'm not going to get into all the details of the various pros and cons of the options that we considered. But through our searching and through our contacts that we made at YC 2019, we got in touch with this company called Narrator, who they very strongly advocated for us to use open source technology to bring as much of our data stack in-house as possible. So get rid of Google Analytics, get rid of Amplitude, set up a data warehouse, because this would allow us, well, remove lock-in and make the whole thing a lot more kind of scalable and sustainable going forward. Narrator do actually offer this kind of as a service, but they didn't have capacity to take us on at the time. But they introduced us to a company who did, called Snowplow. I'll say a little bit about what Snowplow does because it's kind of relevant. So Snowplow is an open source, but they offer a managed service technology product. And it's kind of like the event side of Amplitude. So event tracking on your site merged in with the page view data from Google Analytics. And they deduplicate and clean up and enrich this data, and then they send it all straight to a data warehouse. And thankfully for us and our little team of 2 data analysts, they also provided this service called a Kickstarter, where they set up your data warehouse. They got you started on a few BI tools. And so after a couple of months working with Snowplow, this is what our data stack looked like. So we ditched Amplitude, we ditched Google Analytics. We had our event and page view data going straight from Snowplow into our shiny new Redshift warehouse. And we took all our other data sources in the business, so the production database and Zendesk and SendGrid and all sorts of things. And we used stitchdata.io to bring all of those data sources together. And we also sent those to the warehouse. And we were pretty happy with this because we now had this huge repository of all the possible business data that we could draw upon. And so we put a pretty lightweight BI tool. This is Redash, if you're familiar with it. We put quite a lightweight BI tool on the top of this, and we gave it to the team. And we were like, here you go. Now you can analyze all of the things that you want to analyze. Unfortunately, that didn't quite work out as planned. This is because all of the different sources of data which we'd pulled together, as data analysts, we were really familiar with the ins and outs of the tables. We knew what you needed to join where. We knew which data had changed format over time. But for other people trying to work with that data and analyze and ask meaningful business questions, there was a key problem. And that was that the shape of the data in our warehouse didn't line up with the way that people thought about concepts in our business. I can paint an example of this. Customer referral is a pretty common user journey. And if you were asking about, how many referrals have we made this month, or what is the likelihood that someone who refers someone goes on to refer someone else? Not sure I phrased that question correctly, but you know what I mean. People tend to think of referrals as being like a single user journey. So you might expect to see all that data in one table. But because the production site is set up to run a website for a business, it's not designed for analysis. That data is scattered across multiple tables. You might have events, you might have email sends you want to join in there. And so if you're a data analyst, you could pick all that apart, put it together again, and come up with a cohesive analysis. But if you weren't, you were in for a lot of pain. So we needed to do more data modeling. And I think at this point, we were 2 data analysts who hadn't, I learned SQL at Christmas, which kind of says like the level of experience I had with SQL at that time. We need to do a lot more data modeling in order to transform the huge repository that we had into something which was cohesive and useful. And that's where we were very glad that we discovered Dataform, because Dataform, actually, I will tell you a little bit about what Dataform brought to this project and why it really, really helped us in a minute. But first, I'm going to talk you through the way that we reshaped the data which we had into a cohesive stream, and then I'll come back to Dataform. Okay, so when we spoke to people who would be end users of the data at Prolific, what we found is that they all thought about our business with users at the center. And so if all of the data which is sitting in that huge repository is ultimately underpinned by user behavior, then it would follow that you can probably answer every business question you have by focusing on those users. And so we had this hypothesis, which partly came from Narrator, and I suppose action streams, event streams have been around for a while, so it's not entirely novel hypothesis. But we wanted to see whether we could transform all the data we had into a single data structure centered around these concepts of actors and actions and time. And the key difference with the way that our repository, like the warehouse was before this, is that we bring this into a unified structure with all the business data tied into it. And this would mean that whatever type of question you had to ask, you would always be able to go to this action stream and begin your query there. There'd be one singular route to analysis. I'm going to explain that a little bit again, because I think maybe it's a fiddly concept. So the action stream is a long incremental table which contains a single action for everything that the user does or that users do on our site. But it has a limited number of columns. It's pretty much just timestamp, some sort of unique ID for the actor, some name for the action, and then a unique identifier for the action. But even with that data structure, you can answer pretty useful business questions like how many users registered in a given month, or if you have a column in here for revenue, say, which is pretty common across lots of actions in the site, you could see how much revenue you generated in a given month. Even just counts and being able to break things down by timestamps is powerful. This action stream is then supported by two additional sets of tables, or one singular table, the actor table, which allows you to filter the action stream based on static properties of a user. So the actor table is wide rather than long, and it contains email address, user type, account number, various user mapping information. And so if you want to filter actions just by participants or just by people from a certain academic institution, in our case, then you can join actor and the action stream together and filter on that basis. If you're more interested in context around the action, so a common action on our site is publishing a research study, then we have an enrichment table called enrich publish study. Every single action, every different action in the stream has a either 0 or 1 enrichment tables, and then you can join the enrichment table on action ID, and this boosts your action stream up to contain a load of other information about more detail about the action itself. So I'll show you kind of two examples of this. This is an example of working with the action stream in a BI tool called Metabase, which is the tool that we've moved to recently. Simple things like counting the number of actions in a given time is achieved in Metabase in like a couple of clicks. And this turns, this makes it really easy to work with this count data, just like you would in kind of a fully featured event stream piece of software like Amplitude. But if you want to ask more complex questions, say the total number of study places published in a given month, you can join that enrichment table onto the action stream and then sum across properties or take the average of various properties. And so you can see this query is not much more complex, but this kind of concept, by joining on enrichment tables, by filtering on actors, working around this core structure of the action stream, it simplifies all the questions that you have about questions around the business, because you always know that if you start with the action stream, you'll be able to capture all of the data in the warehouse some way or other. In order to build this model, we had a lot of data modeling to do. The underlying production database was a MongoDB, which means typically in some cases you might have one action to generate per record in the database, but in other cases you might have multiple actions to generate from a single record because that record's been touched at various points. So a good example in our case is that a submission to a survey is a single record in the database, but it has 3 timestamps. At some point, a user has started that submission to a survey. At some point, they completed the submission, and later on, a researcher came to review that submission and decided whether to pay the participant or not for their time. So you have to pull 3 separate actions off this single record, and you end up with a kind of complex cascade of transformations. So you can see this rather over-the-top DAG. And this little tiny box here is the single action stream table as the 21 different actions. We think we have around 65 actions, hypothetically, that users could generate on our site. We've only transformed kind of the key 20 at the moment. But you can see as these 20 actions all get pulled into a single table for analysis. And really, building a system as complex as that would just never have been possible without Dataform. I'm not going to go through all of these goals and how the software really helped us to meet them. But one key thing I want to highlight is that in a system like this, where you have every single action has the same pattern, it has the same columns, you've got timestamp, actor, action stream. Basically, if you were writing this in pure SQL, you would have a lot of room for typos and the code would be unreadable because you'd be repeating and copying and pasting over and over again. And if you then wanted to change a column name or change the ordering of columns, it would be a nightmare. Because of SQLX, you can programmatically generate the same block of SQL with a little bit of difference each time, which means that you can keep the clarity of the code and hopefully make it easier to review and understand the logic that you're building. And as you saw on that previous slide, there's a ton of data sets which feed even to only 20 actions. So managing the references and dependencies of all those actions and cleaning as much as we can upstream is vital in order to ensure that the data which reaches the action stream in the end is really robust and reliable. So if we go back to that list of problems that I had at the beginning a year ago when we were looking at revising our data stack, I have listed, well, in fact, we basically managed to conquer all of these with the new setup. Because of all our data is in one place in a Redshift warehouse, questions which we couldn't answer before, we can now answer. And because we use a single action stream model in order to provide access to all of that business data, there aren't multiple routes to get answers to the same question. Crucially, the way that people think about data in our business is reflected in the way that the underlying data is structured. Cool. I'm a little bit over time, so I'm going to rush through this now. Yeah, in retrospective, this was a hard challenge. Although we were 2 at the start, our team has grown, and as we have added lots of new SQL expertise, we have been able to tackle this project much more effectively. We have recently launched Metabase and the action stream to the whole company, and about 50% of employees have now said they've used this data structure and found it useful, which is maybe doesn't sound like as high a number as you might expect, but that's probably a good percentage of the people who actually want to ask questions with data. There's a single route to answering questions, so you can't end up with 2 answers that don't match. That's not to say that we didn't run into challenges. I think, although having seen some of the earlier presentations in this conference, I would say we've really stress tested Dataform, and we've wrestled with some bugs and some kinks, but the team has been amazingly responsive, and we've kind of overcome a lot of those problems together, and that's been great. The whole design pattern of transforming all business data into a single set of tables and coherent structure is fiddly, and there's lots of incremental field updates and other technical details which we're still wrestling with, but we're finalizing those and we're working it out. And I think it has really been worth it. Doing this amount of data modeling was a challenge, but it was fundamental in order to really democratize our data to the wider team. Yeah, and I feel like I've already said these conclusions. So I think if you can align the data in your warehouse with the way that people conceptualize the data in your business, then it just lets them ask and answer those questions much more effectively. So that's pretty much it. I should briefly say that we are currently hiring for a senior data analyst because we want to continue growing our team. So if if you're interested, check out prolific.co/careers, and there's like a full job spec and lots more information there. But other than that, if anyone has any questions about the model or our journey, then I'm all ears.
Cool. So I think someone actually did ask a question in the chat. Flavian asked, under this data model, wouldn't you need to always join 2 to 3 tables together? Have you thought about making one large, wider table with everything in it?
That's actually a really good question. And yes, you can. Or rather, so yes, you do normally need to join together multiple tables in order to get answers to complex questions. But I think the premise of this model is that by keeping the central stream as lightweight and as narrow as possible, and joining on when you need to kind of widen the data, you keep the volume of data which you're working with low and then have increased performance as a result. I mean, I think one of the ideas that we're still experimenting with is for questions which are really common, where you need to join, where you're making a couple of joins to bring together an answer to a question which you ask over and over again. You might use a view or create a special data set based on the action stream and the enrichment tables, and that's fine. And I think that's a design pattern we might actually take going forward and build these reporting data sets off the central stream. But the key for us, the difference will be that all of the data has gone through that central model. So you're still answering your question using the principle of there's only one right way to answer the question, which means that you know the data is correct and it's run through all the checks and assertions, etc. So yeah, I think your point is valid, and it's something we might do in future.
Do you have a way of registering new actions in and out? For instance, if you, if someone creates a new flow, do you make them go through a kind of check to make sure it's not similar to an existing action or well defined, or?
Yeah, that's actually why I asked the question of Mike in the last talk, because so while we still haven't, this is still a bit of a work in progress. No, this is still very much a work in progress project, right? And so we haven't completed all the documentation for the steps that would normally be necessary to transform an event that's sent through, say, on Snowplow into a kind of fully conceptualized action. And yeah, I think there will need to be some sort of review process to ensure that new actions aren't added to the stream that are very similar to other actions. It's in some ways like visual inspection through the DAG in Dataform makes that kind of possible, because you can see where data in like underlying tables is flowing, and the way that we've set it up is to try and reduce duplication, basically. So you can see if something is flowing into 2 major views, and there should be conceptual differences between those. But yeah, I think there's an element of kind of gatekeeping and review that is needed. That may prove difficult to scale in the future, but we'll work out a process for it.
Sure, thank you.
Anyone else have a question for Jim?
Maybe one of the things that is relevant to that previous question is that we spent a lot of time before we even built the stream thinking about the defining a set of nouns and verbs that would therefore encapsulate like all possible actions on our site. And if you are proposing a new action, it has to come from this set of nouns and verbs that is defined in our documentation. And so hopefully, because there's only so many ways you can express a given meaning when you've got a limited list of nouns and verbs. And so you're probably going to end up coming up with the same name as an action which already exists, and then you're not going to re-implement it. So that's kind of like a one way which you can think about it. And it also makes the action stream clearer to read. That's
really cool. If you wouldn't mind sharing in Slack after the call what those nouns and verbs are, I think that'd be nice to kind of to get everyone else thinking about what they might be for their own company.
Yeah, cool.
I have a question. As I'm like formulating it, I'm wondering if maybe I'm answering it myself. But one of the things I find, one of the like sources of richest insight in analytics is often not the initial event, but it's the things that you can derive from events. So it's like seeing that someone's done 3 events in a row, for example, or seeing that someone did one event and then didn't do another event within the 6-hour period afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
My question was going to be, how do you deal with that? But now I'm wondering, do you just create kind of synthetic events from those events and feed them back in again at the start of the stream?
Actually, that's a really, really good question. Your suggestion about synthetic events is something which we've considered because it's not so dissimilar. So I think Snowplow generates session end events when someone hasn't been active on a page for a certain amount of time. And that's kind of a similar idea, right? Like you might create an event that represents a group of some sort of flow of interest being completed. And we have this concept of passive events, which is when something happens to a user which they didn't do, but is significant in their user journey. So I think that's something which we might explore because working with like user flow analytics, so this event followed by that event, followed by that event, kind of classic funnels is actually not the easiest thing in Metabase and the action stream at the moment. So I don't think it's a problem with our data structure. I think it's a problem with like, I haven't found any good BI tool that's really set up for this. This open source.
I think it's a SQL thing, really, more than anything. I think it's just like fundamentals of SQL make stuff like funnels just kind of fiddly.
So
you can use Dataform's JavaScript to make funnels.
Yeah. So if it's a flow which we run all the time, it's really easy to do in JavaScript and then generate data set off it. That's like another solution. Basically, we have a lot of solutions. I don't know which is the best yet. I also kind of want to write a Metabase plugin where you can make funnels using dropdowns and it generates all the SQL. And the SQL is a bit of a nightmare, but if you're not actually writing it yourself, then it's not a problem. I think there's ways of doing that kind of analysis. And there's nothing fundamentally bad about an action stream for doing it. In fact, it's a logical ordering of actions already. I need to write some of that down. Does anyone else have questions?
Maybe one just very quick question, follow on. Do you automatically add a count of every event to every user? Or do you have anything like that just like automatically widens that table every time a new event gets added? That actor, sorry, not user, actor table.
No, but so there are a couple of examples of this kind of data structure on the internet, and one that Narrator set up has this kind of count of actions completed by user as part of their design, but we didn't quite like we haven't really found a good analysis purpose for it, and it's kind of fiddly to calculate, so we haven't included it. And I think there is maybe something to be said about it. We try to keep the actors table as static as possible, with the idea that changes to a user mostly come from events, and like those activities that cause changes should be tracked in the stream. But I think it's kind of like up for debate. I'd be really interested if you can see a use case for that, or like what you use it for.
I think we should start a Slack channel in Dataform users to talk about this event stream idea, because I think it's a cool thing to kind of play around with and think through a bit more. Yeah, thanks.
Awesome.
Cool. If no one else has a question, then I'll really quickly just share one last slide, which basically has a load of our like social medias on it. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to all our speakers. All the talks were really interesting. I hope everyone kind of takes something away from this. So yeah, follow us on Twitter. If you have any nice things to say about this event, we've got a hashtag which is DataFirstLondon. I've taken some screenshots, so I'll be sharing them on our Twitter account. And we also have a Slack channel, which is kind of rapidly growing. And yeah, we talk about a load of different kind of problems on there and how people are approaching them as well. So yeah, if you're not already on that, then please join it. I'll be sending round all the slides and a copy of the recording to everyone here. So yeah, feel free to share those with people who haven't been able to make it as well. Yeah, so cool. Thanks everyone again for coming, and we hope to see you at the next one.
Awesome.
See you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, speakers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.